Guérini sent for him, asked him to come to his office, which was above the club. And Guérini told him that he had an important contract, and he asked David if he were interested. David said, who's the contract on? And Guérini said, an American politician. David asked, well, is it a congressman, a senator? And Guérini said, higher than that. La plus haute légume, he said, the highest vegetable. At that point, of course, David knew who he was talking about. David asked him where was the contract to be carried out. And when Guérini said it would be done inside the United States, David refused on the grounds that that was much too dangerous. In my first conversation with him, he indicated that although he did not know it at the time, it was he who converted the heroin payment into cash for the assassins. He indicated, at least initially, that the three men had appeared at his apartment in Buenos Aires in the months following the assassination with, as he put it, a substantial quantity of heroin. He was surprised because, to his knowledge, it was the first time that any of the three of them had dealt in heroin. But given his reputation for not asking embarrassing questions, he simply agreed to convert the heroin into cash for them.
Did they ever give you any indication about who was behind this contract?
No, they didn't talk to me about that. It was Christian David who told me that it was someone in the Mafia, but I don't know who it was.
But it was known more or less generally in this circle of Frenchmen in South America that it was the Mafia that was behind it.
Yes.
My own conviction at this point is that the contract probably originated with Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, who placed it in Marseille through his colleague Santos Traficante Jr., who had the closest relations with Antoine Guérini. Beyond that, it seems reasonable that Giancana of Chicago was involved, if we accept David and Michel's idea that the assassins were met at the border by representatives of the Chicago Mafia. And the fact that Sarti's customers were primarily in New York, and the fact that the assassins evidently moved out of the United States through the Montreal corridor, which was very closely linked to the New York Mafia, also suggests that Gambino may have been involved.
In your view, why would they go so far to find assassins for such a job?
In my opinion, to obliterate any traces, to fool the government. Yes, it's more difficult to find foreign killers. It's more difficult, in my view.
In 1966, Carlos Marcello was staring down threats from every direction. But Marcello wasn't the type to back down. What made him dangerous was what made him strong. When he was left alone, without the constant chase of law enforcement, that's when he slipped up. That's when they caught him. But when his back was against the wall, when Washington and the FBI pressed hardest, that's when Marcello was at his most dangerous. He promised his wife that nothing would happen to the family while he was alive. And he kept that promise. For decades, through indictments, deportations, and investigations, Marcello not only survived, he ruled. Marcello was one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. He was the reason I started this series, to explain the power of the Southern Mafia, and to detail its history through the man who embodied it. Through Marcello, we learn about the underworld of Louisiana, the crime families that came before him, the ones that surrounded him, and the ones that followed in his shadow. In '66, the pressure was boiling. Internally, his own people were restless. Externally, law enforcement circled tighter. Silvestro Carollo, otherwise known as Silver Dollar Sam, had returned from exile, stirring old loyalties. In the wake of President Kennedy's assassination, suspicion lingered, and Marcello's enemies whispered that he had gone too far. A sit-down was demanded. At the same time, Tommy Lucchese, the New York boss who had once backed Marcello, was dying of a brain tumor. His crime family needed a successor. The commission called for a meeting at La Stella restaurant in New York. Behind closed doors, the future of several families was decided. Marcello kept his crown. New successors were named. Business went on. But back in New Orleans, things heated fast. The FBI, watching closely, moved in. Agents had heard about Marcello's arrest in New York and decided to rattle him at home. They even dragged along a journalist to catch it on film. At the New Orleans airport, when an FBI agent confronted him, Marcello didn't just talk back. He balled his fist and cracked the agent square on the jaw. He cocked back for a second shot before his brother pulled him away. The reporter, expecting a trophy picture, was too stunned to click his camera. Back at the newsroom, his colleagues toyed with him, leaving fake death threats in his desk, letting him sweat, convincing him he had crossed the black hand. Months later, they confessed it was just office pranks. But the message was clear. When it came to Marcello, even the press walked careful. He survived the 1960s the same way he had survived everything else, by outlasting his enemies. Through the 70s, he ruled New Orleans with the same quiet, dangerous authority. What follows now is every FBI file released on Carlos Marcello. Some remain locked away by the Bureau and the CIA, still classified. But from what's available, spanning the late 1950s through the 80s, we can piece together his life. This is Marcello's story, told through the Bureau's own words. By the fall of 1989, Carlos Joseph Marcello, the man who for decades had ruled the New Orleans mob with an iron fist and a backroom grin, was finishing a long stretch inside the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota. He was 79, frail on paper, but no one in law enforcement believed he had stopped playing the game. The Bureau had him under constant watch. A priority cable dated October 23, 1989, moved fast across FBI desks, Minneapolis to Washington, Los Angeles, and New Orleans. Stamped original and tagged armed and dangerous, the file carried a warning. Marcello was still conspiring, still dangerous, and still talking about killing a federal officer. The potential victim, as the Bureau coldly phrased it, was Special Agent, name redacted, stationed out of New Orleans. Another potential target. The memo laid out the chain of command: violent crimes, supervisors, field officers, and supervisors swapped intelligence like gamblers passing chips across a table. At the center of it all was Marcello, locked up but not silent. He had taken to confiding in his cellmate, Auguste Jerome Rousseau, a Chicago hustler born in 1928, who'd been convicted in Operation Safe Bet, a RICO case tied to prostitution rackets. Rousseau acted as servant and confidant, playing nurse to the aging mob boss. What he overheard, he passed along. Marcello, the files noted, currently has inmate Auguste Jerome Rousseau, white male, born August 4, 1828, from Chicago, Illinois. Rousseau was a convicted player, but also one of those jailhouse figures who learned to leverage access. The FBI tapped him for information. Rousseau told them Marcello still talked like a boss, still thought like a boss. On October 16, 1989, Marcello's release from federal custody drew fresh urgency. The New Orleans division sent cables warning agents to notify any potential target of Marcello to include special agents and former undercover operatives. Minneapolis at Rochester, Minnesota was ordered to follow and report departure of Carlos Marcello. The Bureau worried not just about old grudges, but about Marcello's tricks. In one report, a source advised that Marcello is able to play the part of a person who has little mental ability. He could fake dementia at will. On one occasion he sat silent, dull-eyed, while prison staff examined him, acting the fool. The moment they left, he resumed his normal conversation, sharp as ever. The old fox hadn't dulled. He'd just learned to use age as camouflage. Rousseau added more color. He said Marcello would talk casually in Italian about solutions to problems. And the solution, more often than not, was simple. Kill the person who is the problem. Russo described one chilling moment when Marcello mimed a throat-slashing gesture. The Bureau pressed Russo. Was he angling for money? Was he exaggerating? Russo denied any payoff. He said he felt sorry for Marcello, an old man, and had taken care of him out of sympathy. Still, he admitted he'd provided Marcello's inmate number to Marcello's attorney, a small but dangerous lifeline. By December 13th, 1989, with Marcello due for release, the FBI put its concerns on paper again. Marcello currently is an inmate at the Federal Medical Center, Rochester, Minnesota, and will be released from custody on Friday, December 23rd, 1989. The directives came down hard. New Orleans agents were told to maintain coverage by appropriate sources to attempt to block any potential murder by Marcello of a federal officer. Minneapolis agents were to shadow his departure from Rochester. Every line of the file dripped with tension. They knew the old man wasn't finished. In their bureaucratic shorthand, the memos told a cinematic story. An aging boss feigning senility, whispering threats to kill agents, plotting from behind prison walls. His name alone, Carlos J. Marcello, still pulled alarms across multiple field offices. And as Christmas 1989 approached, the Bureau braced for the moment Marcello would walk out of federal custody and back into New Orleans, where every enemy and ally would be watching. On the morning of October 20th, 1989, Rochester, Minnesota was cold and grey when Carlos Joseph Marcello walked out of the Federal Medical Center. At exactly 8:30 a.m., agents noted, a silver Cadillac with Minnesota plates pulled into the lot. Inside were 2 men and 2 women in fur coats, waiting like royalty's escort. Local television crews had already set up outside the gates, tipped off that the boss of bosses was about to be freed. Marcello, 79 years old, still compact and sharp-eyed behind his glasses, stepped into the Cadillac. Within minutes, he was on the move. Surveillance teams followed the car to Rochester Airport. At the tarmac, Marcello boarded a Learjet, identification number N50MJ, and by late morning he was back in the air, heading for New Orleans. Inside the Cadillac sat August Jerome Russo, his cellmate and caretaker. Russo, born in Chicago in 1928, 5'10", 182 pounds, balding and grey, had become Marcello's shadow in prison. He said he felt sorry for the old man, claimed Marcello was slipping into dementia. But when agents sat Russo down in September 1989, he told them the old fox still had teeth. Russo described first meeting Marcello on the 3rd floor of Building 9. The mob boss, he said, was a little old man who was wandering around, not knowing what was going on. Other inmates had been misusing Marcello's commissary card, forging his signature. Russo stepped in, guided him back, and soon Marcello was living in his cell. From that moment, Russo said, "I took care of him." But there was nothing simple about that caretaking. Russo said Marcello would drift, forget his name, then snap into clarity when talk turned to New Orleans, Guatemala, or old grievances. Marcello remembered his deportation. He didn't remember Russo's first name. Some days he would ask Russo to write his own name on paper, then guess it wrong. And yet Marcello could talk about enemies. Russo said he often heard Marcello mutter in Italian, faking senility with the prison doctors, only to switch back into sharp, deliberate speech with him. Marcello made gestures across his throat, mimicking a cut. Russo recalled him saying, in no uncertain terms, "We're gonna kill that son of a bitch." The Bureau took it seriously. On October 23rd, 1989, New Orleans agents sent an armed and dangerous cable to Washington, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Seattle. The subject line carried 2 volatile phrases: Carlos Marcello, conspiracy to impede or injure a federal officer, and beneath it, another heading: assassination of President John Kennedy. The reference was not casual. Marcello's name had been tied to the Kennedy assassination for decades, whispered through informants, splashed across books like Mafia Kingfish, The Life and Times of Carlos Marcello. Russo himself said he had seen the book inside the prison, ordered and delivered for Marcello. The Bureau never forgot the connection, never dismissed it. Inside FBI offices, supervisors passed the case back and forth like a live grenade. Minneapolis was told to assume origin of the threat, since that was where Marcello had been housed. Los Angeles, Dallas, New Orleans, and even Seattle were notified. On October 23rd, a retired special agent, a man who had worked Marcello for years, confirmed to a colleague that the threats were real, and that the target was exactly who the Bureau feared. The memos recorded the chain in precise language. October 17th, 1989. Minneapolis teletype to FBI HQ. October 19th, 1989. New Orleans notified. October 24th, 1989. Los Angeles, Dallas, Seattle, all briefed. The names were redacted in the files, but the story was clear. A sitting or former federal agent in New Orleans was marked, and Marcello, fresh out of prison, had said the words himself. Meanwhile, Russo's debriefings painted a complicated picture. He swore he wasn't in the mob, insisted he had no ties to Joseph Ayupa or the Chicago outfit. He said he spoke only passable Italian, not as well as Marcello, and sometimes thought the old man was faking his fluency. He described Marcello as a man who read the Times-Picayune in 2 seconds flat, unable to process the words. Yet in the next breath, he admitted Marcello still drew other inmates close, whispering promises of visits in New Orleans, telling stories about the Kennedy family, about deportations, about killing problems rather than solving them. On September 20th, 1989, Russo was formally interviewed at Rochester. He gave the Bureau his full pedigree. Born August 4th, 1928, Chicago. He insisted he was only looking after an old man with arteriosclerosis, who had undergone leg surgery, who sometimes didn't know what year it was. But to agents, his statements painted another portrait. A boss who could pretend senility, mask his intent, and then let slip the most dangerous words imaginable. By October 26th, 1989, with Marcello now back in New Orleans, the Bureau's urgency was obvious. Surveillance reports documented every move. The Cadillac, the Learjet, the women in fur coats. Field offices from Los Angeles to Dallas logged teletype updates. A U.S. Marshal in New Orleans was briefed on the possible threat. The directive was explicit. Appropriately warn those responsible for the safety of the situation. The boss was home. And despite the frailty, despite the fog of age, Carlos Marcello's return was treated by the FBI as the return of a loaded gun. October 1989. Inside the Federal Medical Center at Rochester, Minnesota, the legend of Carlos Joseph Marcello was colliding with the frailty of an 80-year-old man. On paper, he was a patient diagnosed with senile dementia, admitted March 1st, 1989, discharged October 20th. The Bureau of Prisons medical summary described him as severely impaired, unable to find his room, unable to place phone calls, unable to remember even what country he was in. But inside the cell block, that wasn't the whole story. Marcello's closest witness was his cellmate, August Jerome Russo. Chicago-born in 1928, Russo was no stranger to the life. Sentenced under RICO in Operation Safe Bet, he became the caretaker and informant for the boss. By September, FBI agents were pulling Russo into rooms and pressing him for details. He gave them everything: the jokes, the threats, the gestures, the contradictions. One morning in mid-October, Russo said, Marcello's voice rose in his room, "I'm gonna kill that son of a bitch." Russo tried to deflect it with humor, asking if Marcello meant killing himself, but the context was clear. Marcello had enemies, and even at his age, even from behind prison walls, he still talked like a man who ordered murders. Russo described how the old mob boss could turn on and off like a switch. With the prison staff, he'd play the fool, wandering hallways, slurring, staring blankly. With Russo, he'd whisper about vendettas. Once, while they sat together, Marcello said that when he got out, he was going to get the motherfucker who put him there, drawing a hand across his throat, ear to ear. He spoke in Italian with other inmates, at times fluently, at times fumbling. Russo thought he was faking. Marcello didn't always remember names. He called Russo simply Gus, and sometimes forgot even that. But he remembered the things that mattered. His deportation to Guatemala decades earlier, his enemies in New Orleans, his theory that President John Kennedy had been put there by the mob, but killed when he and Bobby stopped playing ball. The Bureau listened closely. In their files, they marked the names of potential victims. They tied Marcello's words back to old suspicions about Dallas, 1963. They cabled Los Angeles, Dallas, Seattle, New Orleans, every field office that had ever crossed paths with him. Inside the prison, Marcello's behavior was more complex. Russo told agents that Marcello slapped him, sometimes jokingly, sometimes leaving bruises on his post-surgery legs. The old boss would swing shoes at him, then laugh. Marcello was described as treating Russo like a body servant, a valet who brushed his teeth, ordered his clothes, fetched his food. On one occasion, when Russo reminded him to do something, Marcello exploded. "No motherfucker tells Carlos Marcello what to do." At the same time, Marcello drew respect. In the yard, benches emptied when he approached. In the TV room, inmates made space. Even the predators of prison deferred. He was old, he was frail, but he was still the boss. Meetings happened quietly. On October 18, 1989, an inmate escorted Marcello off his hospital floor into the open compound. Witnesses later told the FBI that Marcello was introduced to another inmate who spoke Italian, possibly Vito Giacalone, the Detroit capo long tied to Jimmy Hoffa. Marcello's demeanor would switch, vacant in front of staff, sharp once the door closed. As his release approached, preparations were made with precision. Russo ordered civilian clothes, a pale brown jacket, dark brown pants, beige sweater vest, yellow shirt, reddish-brown shoes. A hat waited in the car. Marcello would leave low-key, but leave in style. October 20th, 1989. Gold Crown limousine service received a call at 7:40 a.m. to send a car to the Kayla Hotel. A Cadillac with Minnesota plates picked up 2 women in fur coats, 2 men, and drove to the Federal Medical Center. Cameras from local TV stations swarmed outside. By 8:30, Marcello emerged. Slight, balding, but carrying himself like a don, he stepped into the Cadillac. From there, he was driven to the airport, escorted onto a Lear jet. The FBI noted the tail number, N50MJ. Destination, New Orleans. The Bureau's reports grew urgent. Appropriately warn those responsible for safety of situation, one cable instructed. Special agents in New Orleans were briefed. A U.S. Marshal in Louisiana was warned of possible threat. Dallas files still carried the words, "Assassination of President John F. Kennedy." Marcello was home. Russo remained behind. He told the Bureau he wouldn't follow. Parole forbade it. But he left them with one final warning. Marcello may look like a confused old man, may talk like he doesn't know where he is. But when the fog lifted, he still thought like a boss. And bosses, Russo said, never forget and never forgive, even if it takes 10, 20, 30 years. The first time the Bureau put Carlos Joseph Marcello's name in black ink was September 5, 1952. The memo was brief, almost clinical, but the portrait was already vivid. Marcello, it said, had been born in Tunis, North Africa, on February 16, 1910. His parents brought him to the United States as a boy in 1910, citizens themselves since 1944. By the time the FBI was writing about him, Marcello was a large-scale slot machine operator, entrenched in Jefferson Parish casinos, dabbling in narcotics trafficking across the Gulf of Mexico. His shrimp boats weren't just for shrimp. They were suspected carriers of marijuana shipments. He had already been convicted once for assault and battery, narrowly avoiding deportation on the grounds that his crime did not involve moral turpitude. Even in those early files, the Bureau described him as a dangerous man in a growing empire. By the 1970s, Marcello's empire had matured. No longer just the racketeer with shrimp boats, he was now a businessman, at least on the surface. His company, Pelican Tomato, dominated the produce trade in New Orleans. Behind crates of tomatoes and potatoes, the FBI suspected, was something darker. On October 3, 1979, the special agent in charge of the New Orleans office sent a teletype to Washington. A confidential police source had come forward. Carlos Marcello, LCN head, New Orleans, Louisiana, was bribing officials in the Defense Supply Agency, the arm of the Pentagon that bought food for the military. Pelican Tomato, the memo said, had a virtual monopoly on supplying tomatoes to the Department of Defense in New Orleans. Bribes were being passed at Marcello's company headquarters. For months, the Bureau probed. By May 1980, the investigation was tied into Bry Lab, the sprawling sting operation targeting labor racketeering and insurance scams across the mob. Wiretaps buzzed, intercepts were pulled. But when analysts combed through the tapes, no mention of Pelican Tomato surfaced. Not one word about Marcello bribing defense officials. The case refused to die. In July 1980, headquarters reminded New Orleans, submit an initial LHM, letterhead memorandum, spell out the predication, the leads, the Bureau's opinion. The paperwork grew as thick as the crates in Marcello's warehouses. Agents chased down informants, grilled employees of the Defense Supply Agency, and scrutinized Dixie Tomato, Pelican's rival in the potato trade. A report dated August 12, 1980, ran page after page of interviews. One source swore that employees were taking kickbacks funneled through Pelican. Another described bundles of russet potatoes shipped from Dixie and Mayenza and Sons, the prices carefully arranged. Pelican, the report said, had a virtual monopoly on the tomato market. Contracts were judgmental, subject to interpretation by inspectors, and Marcello was said to have men in the right places. But then the narrative faltered. Inspectors denied wrongdoing. Employees insisted that their dealings with Marcello were chance encounters. One man admitted seeing Marcello at the fishing camp in Grand Isle, Louisiana, but only once, years earlier. Another swore he had never taken an envelope, never seen a dime. He drove an old car, lived paycheck to paycheck, his only luxury, hunting and fishing. His annual salary, $26,794. The Bureau's own electronic intercepts backed them up. Months of taped conversations from 1979 and 1980 produced nothing about bribes, nothing about Pelican or Dixie. In the dry language of the August 12th memorandum, no additional investigation is being conducted. And so, as with so many Marcello cases, the evidence dissolved. Bribes were suspected, monopolies noted, informants whispered. But when the intercepts failed to deliver, the case went dark. By January 1990, the New Orleans office was weary of the entire subject. A memo, dated January 22nd, closed the matter administratively. No violation substantiated. Marcello, now back in New Orleans, case closed. The boss who once trafficked shrimp boats full of marijuana, who controlled casinos and produced warehouses, had survived again, untouched, his paper trail ending not with indictment, but with a shrug. By the early 1950s, Carlos Marcello had already built a reputation in Louisiana that blended gambling boss with street brawler. But to the Department of Justice, he was something else. An alien, born in Tunis, North Africa, who had slipped into America as a child. And under the new Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, that made him vulnerable. On December 30th, 1952, Attorney General James P. McGranary announced to the press that Carlos Marcello of Miami, Florida, and Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, had been arrested on a deportation warrant. The arrest was described as the first major deportation move under the new act. Marcello, the DOJ said, was engaged in large-scale slot machine operations and other gambling activities, and he had a record. The conviction they reached back for was 1938. Violation of the Marijuana Act. In Louisiana courts, he had also done time for assault and robbery, sentenced in 1930 to a term of 9 to 14 years before winning a full pardon from the governor in 1935. On paper, Marcello looked like exactly the kind of undesirable alien the new law was designed to expel. By June 1953, FBI memoranda show the plan in motion. Marcello would be picked up in New Orleans, held in custody, allowed only brief, supervised releases to wind up his personal affairs, and then shipped under escort to Ellis Island for deportation proceedings. But Marcello didn't go quietly. He lawyered up, fighting the case with attorney William Orchard. Appeals were filed, briefs challenged the constitutionality of the McCarran Act, and delays mounted. A September 28, 1953, memo to the director of the FBI noted the government expected to win, but admitted Marcello's tactics were stretching the fight out. Rumors flew through the underworld. Informants whispered to the Bureau about who might inherit Marcello's empire if he were deported. Some said Ralph Capone, Al Capone's brother, might come to New Orleans to take the position. Others named old guard figures like Joe Conforto. Police sources claimed Marcello still controlled the race wire service across the city, and while the courts dragged on, Marcello reinvested. Confidential sources told the FBI he had poured money into the tourist court business, opening a motel called the Tulane on Airline Highway in Jefferson Parish, just outside New Orleans. Agents noted his regular presence there, as well as in local restaurants and country clubs. He was visible, confident, unshaken. In October 1954, another memo updated headquarters. Marcello's deportation case was now pending appeal before the U.S. Supreme Court. He had even hired a new attorney out of Washington, D.C., a sign that the fight would continue at the highest levels. Meanwhile, the Louisiana State Police raided wire service headquarters in Jefferson Parish and confiscated 20 handbooks and telephones, widely understood to be a Marcello operation. The Bureau continued to list him under top hoodlum coverage. The memoranda piled up with his aliases Calogero Minacore, Carlos Jr., Caloreo Minacore, the little man. Each year brought another update. Still pending, still appealing, still operating. By the mid-1950s, the deportation drive had slowed. Marcello had done what mob bosses do best: outlasting. While the government shuffled papers and drafted memos, he opened businesses, courted allies, and built the empire that would make him one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. By the mid-1950s, Carlos Marcello's status in the United States was under intense legal siege. His fate, whether he would remain in Louisiana or be forced out as an undesirable alien, now rested in the hands of the highest court in the land. A memorandum dated March 24, 1955, from the special agent in charge of New Orleans to the director of the FBI reflected the continuing drama. It noted that deportation proceedings against Marcello were still pending before the United States Supreme Court. His longtime attorney, William Orchard, had recently died in New Orleans, and it was uncertain how this would affect the case as it advanced toward a final ruling. Rumors swirled constantly. Information, though unconfirmed, suggested Marcello was still active in the gambling fields of New Orleans. Reports surfaced from immigration authorities and informants that he was exploring investments in gambling establishments in Mississippi, including one at Pearlington. Some accounts alleged that Marcello had taken an interest in a casino run by a Mississippi gambler, though conflicting sources insisted Marcello was not financially backing the venture. Meanwhile, in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, Marcello's influence remained formidable. Sheriff George Gillespie reported that Marcello was ruthless in his business dealings, particularly in money lending and foreclosure. He was seen as both a gangster and an increasingly legitimate businessman. There was talk that he had acquired an interest in the Motel de Ville, a luxury tourist hotel in New Orleans. At the same time, speculation continued about his possible involvement in the Claiborne Towers project, the largest apartment building in the city, though the deal appeared stalled. Silent partnerships were also alleged. The Citizens Bank and Trust Company of Jefferson Parish was said to have officers quietly backing Marcello in a charter boat dock venture at Grand Isle, operating under the name Fisherman's Bar. The government pressed forward. On June 7, 1955, an office memorandum reported directly to Assistant FBI Director Tolson summarized the state of the case. Marcello, convicted in 1938 of violating the Marijuana Tax Act and sentenced to a year in prison, was deemed deportable under the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. The law allowed deportation at any time for such a conviction, even though the offense had occurred before the law was enacted. Marcello challenged the order, arguing that the retroactive application of the 1952 Act was unconstitutional. He claimed his deportation hearings violated due process, that the Attorney General's public statements had prejudiced his case, and that the so-called special inquiry officers, who presided over immigration hearings, were improperly subject to both prosecutorial and supervisory authority, undermining fairness. Despite these objections, the courts consistently ruled against him. The special inquiry officer rejected his arguments. The Board of Immigration Appeals affirmed the deportation order. The District Court likewise upheld the government's position, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals followed suit. Marcello's case then reached the Supreme Court of the United States as Marcello versus Bonds. On May 31, 1955, Justice Tom Clark delivered the opinion. The court affirmed the lower court's rulings, holding that Marcello's deportation order was valid. The justices ruled that the 1952 Immigration Act's deportation provisions applied to past convictions and were not barred by the ex post facto clause of the Constitution. The court also rejected Marcello's claim that the use of special inquiry officers violated the Administrative Procedure Act. Although these officers operated under the supervision of the Immigration Service, the court found that Congress intended deportation hearings to be governed by the Immigration Act, not by the stricter requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. The decision struck at the heart of Marcello's defense. His objections were deemed without substance. His allegations of prejudice and procedural unfairness were dismissed. The court concluded that the government had acted within its powers to deport an alien convicted of a serious offense, regardless of when that conviction had occurred. Though Marcello remained in the United States as appeals and maneuvers continued, the Supreme Court's ruling marked a devastating blow. It showed the federal government's determination to strip him of the shield of citizenship and to remove him from the country by legal means. Yet, even as the justices ruled, Marcello's empire in Louisiana, through gambling, loans, and legitimate fronts, only grew more entrenched. The law declared him unwanted, but in New Orleans, Carlos Marcello was still the little man who wielded enormous power. Carlos Marcello was a name that carried weight in New Orleans. To law enforcement, he was a problem that wouldn't go away. To his own people, he was the little man who ran Jefferson Parish like his own empire. By the spring of 1957, the U.S. Immigration Service was still trying to deport him. Marcello had been fighting the case in court for months, but while the lawyers argued, he kept busy. He wasn't hiding. He was running hotels that doubled as meeting spots, cash cows, and operations centers. One of them was the Town and Country Motel on Airline Highway, just outside the New Orleans city limits, perched near the Mississippi River. Another was the Holiday Motel, 5 miles downriver on the West Bank. Officially, they were tourist courts. Unofficially, they were part of Marcello's network. Agents reported he was also knee-deep in the racehorse racket. Handbooks, wire services, the kind of action that flowed through bookies and gamblers across Louisiana. By late 1956, whispers were spreading further south. A source told investigators that Marcello was setting up gambling operations in Guatemala. If the government pushed him out of the States, he'd already carved himself out of a backup plan overseas. Closer to home, Marcello was expanding his reach in land deals. He was tied to a purchase of property in Houma and Morgan City, Louisiana, 12 grand's worth, with rumors that even the local police chiefs had stakes in the deal. Not everyone played ball. Harry J. Spiro, a New Orleans real estate dealer, tried to cut in on Marcello's business, muscling for land. He didn't last. According to informants, Marcello had him murdered. The Spiro killing went down as one of New Orleans' many unsolved cases, a murder tied to the same orbit of gangland violence that seemed to circle Marcello. And Spiro wasn't the only one. Reports claimed Marcello had dealings with a Chinese operator in the narcotics trade. When the man supposedly double-crossed him, he wound up dead too. Even his stepdaughter was caught up in the violence, another unsolved murder floating in the same shadows. The Bureau pressed its contacts. On January 4th, 1957, New Orleans police passed on what they had, but little could be confirmed. By March, investigators admitted the stories couldn't be nailed down. The murders had all the marks of gangland hits, but no clean line tied them directly to Marcello. Still, inside the Bureau, his name carried weight. When Washington asked for a roll call of the nation's top hoodlums, New Orleans sent back one name, Carlos Marcello. No rivals, no challengers. He was it. Bureau files show the back and forth. A summary was late arriving from New Orleans, the yellow copy of the report mistakenly left behind in the shuffle. But when it did arrive in July 1957, the message was clear. The New Orleans division didn't need a list of names. They only had one. Carlos Marcello was the boss. By the summer of 1957, the Bureau had settled on one conclusion. When it came to organized crime in New Orleans, there was only one name that mattered, Carlos Marcello. Sheriff William Coetzee of Jefferson Parish, working with Marcello, had set up coin machine distribution companies that controlled the local slot machine racket. Variety Amusement Company on the East Bank, Huey Distributing Company on the West. Both were fronts. Their purpose was simple: lock down the market on coin-operated slot machines across Jefferson Parish. Deputies and parish officials pressured businesses to use only Marcello's machines. It was an old story. Politicians provided cover while Marcello collected the money. Marcello didn't stop at machines. By July 1957, he had picked up an interest in a jewelry store near the Roosevelt Hotel, a high-traffic spot in downtown New Orleans. Informants said he was also moving into big real estate deals, including $1 million housing development in the lake area. His legal holdings were always cloaked, acquired through intermediaries and associates, but everyone knew the little man had cash tied up all over the city. His routine was steady. He ate at Domino's restaurant on St. Charles Avenue or checked in at the Town and Country Motel. Officially, he was tied up in deportation proceedings, forced to remain in New Orleans. But the restriction didn't stop him from working. Marcello surrounded himself with men he trusted, mostly Italian, often family. In St. Bernard Parish, one of his people ran a large handbook operation. Marcello quietly cut himself in for a 20% piece. The man, described as a muscle type, pushed business hard, soliciting bets openly, directing gamblers into Marcello's orbit. Agents noted the setup. Regular bettors, observed placing wagers, were steered to this crew, ensuring the money flowed to Marcello's book. George Gillespie, a deputy sheriff who knew the lay of the land, told investigators in July 1957 that Marcello was keeping a low profile. He was spending more time at home, living quietly while his operations carried on through proxies. It was the classic move of a boss who didn't need to be seen to be in control. Marcello's record, however, told the story of how far he had come. It stretched back to 1929, when he was first picked up as an accessory after a bank robbery in Algiers. The charge was dismissed, but it set the tone. In 1930, he was arrested again for robbery and assault, sentenced to 9 to 14 years. He didn't serve the full bid, paroled, then pardoned in 1935. By 1938, he had moved into the narcotics trade. Arrested multiple times for marijuana violations, possession, sale, transport, he served time in Atlanta Penitentiary. Even then, he slipped through cracks, cases dismissed, sentences shortened, charges dropped. The pattern was clear. Marcello had the connections and the money to beat the system. In 1944, he was back on the books for a BPA violation. The same year, his brother Carlos Jr. was arrested for immigration violations. In 1951, Marcello himself refused to testify before a Senate committee. His defiance wasn't just legal maneuvering, it was a message. He answered no one outside his world. The FBI's top hoodlum program demanded updates on each city's underworld leaders. By October 1957, the New Orleans division had its answer. They didn't need a long list. The paperwork went upstairs with one name stamped across it: Carlos Marcello. The little man ran New Orleans, and everybody knew it. By the fall of 1957, Marcello was back in Jefferson Parish business. Gambling spots that had gone quiet started to stir again. Small-scale, low-profile, but unmistakably tied to him. O'Dwyer's home, Gallows on Chesterfield Street, Horace Perez's place on Jefferson Highway. Perez was an old hand around New Orleans, and everybody knew he was tied in with Marcello. When Perez tried to bankroll a casino in Mississippi 2 years earlier, Marcello had backed him through Joe Pecoraro, better known as Joe Peck. The deal blew up under local pressure, and Marcello ate a $50,000 loss. Now, informants said, he was making Perez whole by quietly staking him again. Perez grumbled about keeping Marcello's books, but had no choice. In Jefferson Parish, nobody operated without Marcello's nod. Pecoraro himself was still close living on Elysian Fields, running the Idle Hour bar on St. Philip. He wasn't just a friend. He was Marcello's fixer, fronting money, placing bets, keeping the rackets humming. 2 decades later, the Bureau was still chasing Marcello, but now the game had shifted. It wasn't slot machines or handbooks, it was bank records, corporate shells, and subpoenas. In 1977, Marcello faced a new kind of heat: perjury before a Miami grand jury. The case came out of UNIRAC, the government's organized crime task force, and centered on whether Marcello lied under oath about his business dealings. Investigators tore into his finances. They combed through bank accounts linked to Gulf Coast Fabricators and Container Service Corporation. Following transfers funneled through as many as 18 accounts in 13 to 15 banks. They found at least $156,000 quietly routed into Marcello's accounts, then shifted again into corporate structures under his control. By their count, Marcello had a minimum of 30 corporate accounts in New Orleans banks, plus multiple personal checking accounts under different covers. The FBI's theory was simple. Prove the money trail, prove Marcello lied, and use it to nail him on perjury. Subpoenas went out across Louisiana and other states. Accounting techs were brought in just to untangle the ledgers. A conference in Miami that May confirmed it. There was enough for a prima facie case. By October, agents had traced property worth over $400,000, sold to Marcello in 1975 through Gulf Coast Fabricators. The transfers were structured, first into Marcello's name, then into his personal accounts, and finally into the corporate maze he built to hide ownership. Investigators confirmed he was deeply involved, directly or through his men. He spent much of that period at the Town and Country Motel, his unofficial headquarters, right next to his own office. The Department of Justice pushed for immunity to compel testimony from reluctant witnesses. Strike force attorneys in Miami and New Orleans pressed the case forward. The Bureau noted bluntly, Marcello had made false statements under oath. But even after all the subpoenas, the financial forensics, the bank trails, the housing projects, the jewelry stores, the slot machine routes, the gambling dens, Marcello was still standing. From the 1930s bank robberies to the 1970s perjury probes, the record was long and dirty. Yet time and again, Carlos Marcello slipped through the government's grip. The little man kept his empire, and the Bureau kept chasing.